April 23, 1945. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside a compound surrounded by wire fencing and wooden watchtowers, somewhere in the vast expanse of rural Montana. 42 German women climbed down from the vehicle, their legs stiff from 3 days of travel across an America they had been taught to fear and despise. They wore the remnants of their auxiliary uniforms, now faded and stained, some bearing patches hastily sewn over tears that told stories of capture and chaos. The spring air carried the scent of grass and distant mountains, so different from the smoke and destruction they had left behind in Europe. Gisela Schreiber steadied herself against the truck's metal side, her dark blonde hair tucked beneath a worn scarf, her green eyes taking in everything with the careful observation of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading situations quickly and accurately. A tall American woman in an officer's uniform stood waiting at the gate, her posture erect, but her expression neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. Captain Dorothy Richardson held a clipboard and waited as the German women formed an uneven line before her. Some stood with military precision despite their exhaustion. Others slumped with the weight of defeat and uncertainty. Gisela found herself in the middle of the formation, close enough to hear clearly, but not so prominent as to draw unwanted attention. She had learned this skill over the past 4 months of captivity, this art of being present but unremarkable, visible but not vulnerable. Captain Richardson began speaking in clear, measured English. Corporal Maria Sanchez, a young Mexican-American woman with kind eyes and patient gestures, translated into German. The usual announcements came first, the rules and routines that governed prisoner life. Morning roll call at 6 o'clock, work assignments at 7, meals at prescribed times, lights out at 9 in the evening. The women listened, with the blank expressions of people who had heard similar instructions in other camps, other countries, expecting nothing but the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. They expected hard bread and watery soup. They expected cold barracks and suspicious guards. They expected to be treated as enemies, because that is what they were. Then Captain Richardson said something that made several women glance at each other in confusion. Corporal Sanchez translated carefully, as if making sure she had heard correctly herself. Fresh milk will be provided with breakfast and dinner daily. There is sufficient supply for all prisoners. You will receive adequate portions at each meal. The words hung in the air like something from a half-forgotten dream. Fresh milk, daily. Several of the younger women whispered to each other in rapid German, questioning whether they had heard correctly. Marlene Koch, who stood beside Gisela, let out a sound that was almost a laugh but died in her throat, as if laughing at such an absurd promise would somehow make it even less real. Gisela felt something twist in her chest, a sensation she could not quite name. It had been more than 3 years since she had tasted fresh milk. 3 years of ersatz everything, of watered-down substitutes and carefully divided rations that never quite filled the gnawing emptiness. She remembered the last time, remembered it with the clarity of a cherished photograph. Summer of 1942. Visiting her mother's sister in the countryside outside Munich, before her aunt's farm had been requisitioned and stripped of its livestock. A glass of cool milk, rich and sweet, sitting on a wooden table in the afternoon sunlight. She had not known then that it would be the last time. You never know when the last time will be the last time. Munich, Germany. October 1938. Gisela Schreiber sat at her family's dining table, 20 years old and newly certified as a primary school teacher, watching golden mid-afternoon light stream through lace curtains her grandmother had made decades earlier. The Sunday meal spread before them represented everything she would later understand as abundance, but then simply accepted as ordinary life. Her mother, Helene, carried a porcelain pitcher from the kitchen, white cream rising to its rim, and poured generous amounts into each coffee cup without hesitation or calculation. There was no measuring, no rationing, no anxious conservation of resources. The cream simply was, as reliable as sunrise, as expected as breathing. Gisela's younger sister Anna, 16 and full of dramatic dreams about becoming an actress, reached for a second slice of butter cake without asking permission. Their father, Ernst, a postal clerk with ink-stained fingers and a gentle disposition, read aloud from the newspaper between bites. His voice, a comfortable background hum to the meal. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, of real coffee, and the particular sweetness of cream beginning to warm in hot liquid. Outside their apartment window, Munich bustled with ordinary weekend activity. People strolled through parks, children chased balls down cobblestone streets, shop windows displayed goods that seemed inexhaustible. Gisela remembered helping her mother prepare that Sunday dinner, remembered the casual way Helene had used real butter for the potatoes, had added cream to the soup, had served milk with the meal, as if these things would always be available. Her mother kept a well-stocked pantry, Shelves lined with preserves and flour, sugar, and coffee. All the ingredients of a comfortable middle-class life, in a country that seemed stable despite the political tensions Gisela only vaguely understood. She was more concerned with her upcoming teaching assignment at the Catholic school near the train station, with whether the children would respect her authority, with how she would manage a classroom of 30 students, ranging from 6 to 10 years old. Anna talked endlessly that afternoon about a boy named Klaus who had smiled at her after church. Their mother reminded her that 16 was too young for serious courtship, but her tone carried affection rather than sternness. Their father turned the newspaper page and commented on something about politics that Gisela promptly forgot, because politics seemed distant and abstract compared to the immediate reality of cream in her coffee and the warmth of family conversation. She took a second helping of cake, reaching across the table to the serving plate, her hand never trembling with the fear that there might not be enough, that someone might begrudge her the extra portion, that tomorrow the cake might be gone and never return. That evening, after Anna had cleared the dishes and their parents had retired to the sitting room to listen to the radio, Gisela stood in the kitchen and poured herself a small glass of milk from the icebox, drinking it slowly while looking out at the darkening street. She could not have known then that she was memorizing a moment that would sustain her through years of hunger. She could not have known that abundance was not permanent, that the ordinary could become extraordinary, that memory could become both comfort and torment. The changes came slowly at first, so gradually that Gisela barely noticed the transformation of her world. 1940 brought the first whispers of rationing, announced as temporary measures to support the war effort. Her mother began collecting ration cards, small pieces of paper that seemed insignificant until they became the difference between eating and going hungry. Butter disappeared first from the markets, replaced by margarine that tasted like salted wax. Then sugar became scarce, then coffee, then one by one, the small luxuries that had made meals feel like home, rather than mere fuel for survival. By 1941, Gisela had been teaching for 3 years at the Catholic school, watching her students arrive each morning with increasingly hollow cheeks and distracted eyes. She noticed how they focused on the lunch period with an intensity that had nothing to do with social play and everything to do with the meager portions distributed by the school kitchen. Some children brought nothing from home. Others carried carefully wrapped packages that contained less each week. She began saving part of her own ration to slip extra bread to the thinnest students, but there was never enough to make a real difference. The propaganda intensified everywhere, posters and radio broadcasts explaining that sacrifice was patriotic, that German strength required German discipline. Gisela found herself attending mandatory meetings for teachers where officials spoke about duty and dedication to the fatherland. The pressure to join the Women's Auxiliary Corps grew stronger with each passing month. Young women were needed to support the war effort, they said. Communications, administration, medical care, all the roles that would free men for combat. Her principal suggested it. Her neighbors mentioned it. Even her father, who had always been gentle and non-political, quietly indicated that participation might be wise for the family's reputation. In April of 1942, Gisela volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps, telling herself she was choosing service over conscription, agency over compulsion. She completed training in communications and radio operation, learning Morse code and encryption basics, studying maps and military protocols. The work felt important in an abstract way, disconnected from the reality of what those communications actually meant on battlefields she could not see. She wore the gray uniform with its crisp lines and insignia, feeling both proud and uncertain in ways she could not articulate even to Anna, who watched her older sister's transformation with worry in her young eyes. By the time Gisela received her posting to occupied France in Indy-Fast, early 1943, fresh milk had become a memory so distant it seemed like something from another lifetime. The military rations provided ersatz coffee made from roasted grain, powdered milk that dissolved into chalky liquid, and portions calculated to the gram for maximum efficiency. She learned to eat without tasting, to drink without enjoying, to stop expecting anything resembling abundance. Her body adjusted to constant low-grade hunger, the kind that never quite disappeared but became background noise to daily existence. She stopped thinking about Sunday dinners and cream-filled coffee cups. Remembering only made the present harder to bear. Northern France, October 1943. Gisela sat in a cramped communications bunker outside Lille, headphones pressed against her ears, transcribing coded messages that arrived in staccato bursts of static and signal. The underground room smelled of damp concrete and unwashed bodies. of the particular staleness that came from too many people in too little space with insufficient ventilation. She worked 8-hour shifts that often stretched to 12 when personnel shortages demanded it, her fingers cramping around the pencil as she copied strings of letters and numbers that determined troop movements, supply routes, and strategic decisions she was forbidden from questioning or fully understanding. The other women in her unit had become her makeshift family. Marlene Koch, a farm girl from Brandenburg with capable hands and a dry sense of humor, worked the shift opposite Gisella's, and they shared a bunk in the barracks above the bunker. Frida Baumann, older than most of them at 35, had been a nurse before the war and now served as their unofficial medical advisor, treating headaches and stomach ailments with whatever limited supplies she could obtain. Liesl Wagner, barely 19, operated the radio equipment with the intense focus of someone determined to prove her competence despite her youth. They did not discuss politics or ideology. They discussed food, sleep, and letters from home when the mail actually arrived. By the winter of 1944, even military rations had diminished to portions that left them constantly lightheaded and cold. The bread was more sawdust than grain. The soup was mostly water with occasional vegetables floating like rumors of better times. Gisela's uniform hung loose on her frame, her ribs visible when she changed clothes. Her period stopped months ago along with those of most other women in the unit. They joked grimly about the auxiliary diet, while their bodies consumed themselves to maintain basic function. The news from the Eastern Front grew worse each week, though official reports tried to frame retreats as strategic repositioning. Gisela could read between the lines of the coded messages she transcribed. She understood that Germany was losing, that the tide had turned somewhere around Stalingrad, and never turned back. The Allied invasion at Normandy in June of 1944 brought the war rushing toward them with terrifying speed. Their unit received orders to relocate, then relocate again, always moving east, as American and British forces pushed deeper into occupied territory. December 1944 found them near the Belgian border in a hastily established position that everyone knew was temporary. The ground froze solid. Their bunker had no heat. Gisela wore every piece of clothing she owned in layers, but still shivered through her shifts. They heard artillery in the distance, growing closer each day. On the morning of December 18th, American forces overran their position before they could evacuate. Gisela remembered the sudden chaos, the shouting in English, the moment of pure terror when she thought she might be shot. Instead, American soldiers herded them into trucks with surprising efficiency and minimal violence. She clutched her small diary, the only personal possession she managed to keep, and watched the frozen French countryside disappear behind them as they began the long journey into captivity. The barracks smelled of fresh pine lumber and soap, so clean it felt almost offensive after months of unwashed concrete and perpetual damp. Gisela had spent her first night in the Montana camp, lying awake on a real mattress with actual blankets, unable to trust the relative comfort, waiting for some cruelty to reveal itself. The other women had whispered anxiously in the darkness, sharing rumors and fears about what American captivity would mean. Some expected forced labor in mines or factories. Others feared worse, remembering the propaganda they had been fed about American brutality and lawlessness. When morning came with nothing more threatening than a bell ringing for roll call, the relief felt almost as disorienting as the fear. The mess hall stood at the center of the compound, a long wooden building with windows that actually let in light. The German women filed in for their first breakfast, moving in tight groups, their eyes scanning for threats or tricks. Long tables stretched in rows, each set with metal plates and cups, simple but clean. The American guards directed them to sit, their gestures more efficient than aggressive. Gisela found herself at a table with Marlene, Frida, and Liesl, the four of them instinctively staying close to the familiar faces from their former unit. Then the kitchen staff emerged carrying large pitchers, and Gisela saw what was inside them. Milk. Not the grayish powder dissolved in lukewarm water they had grown accustomed to, but actual liquid milk, white and opaque, with tiny droplets of condensation forming on the outside of the glass containers. A young American woman, one of the kitchen workers, approached their table and poured the milk into each of their cups, with the casual ease of someone performing a completely ordinary task. The sound of liquid hitting metal echoed across the suddenly quiet room as 42 German women stared at their cups in collective disbelief. Gisela looked down at her portion. The cup was perhaps 2/3 full, more milk than she had seen in a single place in 3 years. Beside her, Marlene made a small choking sound, her hand hovering over her cup as if afraid to touch it. Across the table, young Liesl began to cry silently, tears running down her thin cheeks while she stared at the milk like it was some kind of religious vision. Frida, practical Frida, who had survived everything with stoic determination, closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if trying to compose herself. Some of the women at other tables refused to drink, convinced this was a test or a trap. Katrin Richter, who still wore her loyalty to the Reich like armor, pushed her cup away and sat with her arms crossed, her jaw set in defiant suspicion. But Gisela found herself reaching for her cup with trembling fingers, lifting it slowly to her lips. The first taste hit her tongue like a memory made physical, cool and sweet and rich, with a complexity that powdered substitutes could never replicate. It was real, it was abundant, and she could not understand why her enemies would give her something so precious when her own country had taken it away years ago. The second morning arrived with the same incomprehensible routine. Roll call at 6 o'clock, then the march to the mess hall where breakfast waited with those impossible pitchers of milk sitting on every table. Gisela watched her fellow prisoners approach the meal with varying degrees of acceptance and suspicion. Some women drank eagerly now, their bodies overriding their minds' hesitation. Others still touched their cups cautiously, as if the milk might vanish or transform into something terrible if they showed too much gratitude or relief. Marlene had drunk her entire portion the first morning and spent the afternoon with stomach cramps, her body no longer accustomed to processing real dairy after years of deprivation. She approached the second day's serving more carefully, taking small sips between bites of bread and oatmeal. The bread itself was another shock, made from actual wheat flour rather than the sawdust mixtures they had endured in Germany. The oatmeal came with brown sugar, another luxury that seemed to violate everything they understood about wartime rationing and prisoner treatment. By the third day, something began to shift in the barracks. The women started to believe, cautiously, that this abundance might continue. They compared observations during the evening hours, trying to understand the logic of their captors. Frida, with her medical background, noted how their bodies were responding to proper nutrition. The constant headaches many of them suffered began to ease. Their energy levels improved slightly. Some women reported that their hunger, which had been a constant companion for years, actually diminished after meals rather than simply being temporarily muted. Gisela found herself studying the American Guards with new confusion. Private William Tucker, a lanky young man from Kentucky with sun-weathered skin and an easy manner, seemed genuinely unbothered by the task of guarding enemy prisoners. He made simple conversation through Corporal Sanchez's translations, asking where they were from in Germany, commenting on the Montana weather, treating them like people rather than threats. Sergeant Robert Hayes, older and more reserved, nonetheless ensured that the barracks had sufficient blankets when the mountain nights grew cold. These small kindnesses did not match the image of ruthless American soldiers that Gisela had been taught to expect. The evening of the third day, Gisela sat on her bunk and wrote carefully in her small diary, the pencil stub she had managed to keep pressed against the worn paper. April 26, 1945. Third day in American camp. They give us milk every morning and evening. Real milk? I do not understand this. We are enemies. We served the Reich. Why do they feed us better than our own officers did? What do they want from us? She paused, staring at her own handwriting, then added one more line. I am afraid to trust it, but my body is already beginning to remember what it feels like to not be hungry all the time. Across the barracks, other women were having similar quiet reckonings with reality, their understanding of the world and their place in it beginning to crack along fault lines they had not known existed. 12 miles west of the prison camp, the Miller Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of Montana grassland, with the Rocky Mountains rising like a promise on the western horizon. Tom Miller stood in his dairy barn at 5 o'clock in the morning, the same time he had risen for 40 years, his calloused hands moving through the familiar rhythm of milking. The barn smelled of hay and warm animal bodies, of fresh manure and the sweet scent of milk hitting metal pails. His wife Sarah moved among the cows with quiet competence, speaking softly to each animal by name, her presence calming to the herd and to Tom himself, though he rarely said so aloud. They had received the contract to supply dairy products to the prisoner of war camp 3 weeks earlier, and Tom had accepted it without hesitation, despite Sarah's initial uncertainty. Their son David had died at Normandy, cut down on Omaha Beach in the first terrible hours of the invasion. The telegram had arrived in June of 1944, and something in Tom had hardened that day into a substance that resembled stone but was really just frozen grief. He could have refused to provide milk to German prisoners. Many in town would have understood, perhaps even approved. But Tom Miller did not believe in punishing people with poor food, regardless of what uniform they had worn or what country they had served. Sarah had come around to his thinking after several long conversations in their kitchen, sitting across from each other at the scarred wooden table where they had shared 42 years of marriage, 3 children raised to adulthood, and 1 son lost to war. She had argued initially that giving quality products to the enemy felt like a betrayal of David's sacrifice. Tom had listened, then spoken in his slow, deliberate way about how David had written letters from England, talking about treating prisoners decently, about maintaining honor even in war, about not becoming the thing you fought against. Those letters, carefully preserved in Sarah's desk drawer, had changed her mind more effectively than any argument Tom could have made. Now they delivered milk to the camp 3 times weekly, fresh and cold in steel containers that the camp staff transferred to pitchers for distribution. Tom insisted on the same quality he provided to the grocery stores in town, the same richness and care he gave to products bearing his family's name. Sarah made butter and occasionally sent preserves from her carefully maintained fruit trees, small additions that she told herself were simply practical uses of surplus, rather than acts of particular kindness. Tom's mother, Emma, 83 and still sharp as the kitchen knives she kept meticulously maintained, lived with them in the main house and had opinions about everything. She had declared the camp contract good Christian sense, citing scripture about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked without distinction of nationality. When Tom pointed out that the prisoners were neither hungry nor naked by the time the milk reached them, Emma had waved her hand dismissively and said that was precisely the point of doing right before wrong became visible. 2 weeks into their captivity, the women gathered in small groups during their evening free time, their conversations turning to questions that had no easy answers. Gisela sat with Marlene, Frida and Liesel in a corner of the barracks where the light from the single bulb barely reached, their voices kept low even though no rule prevented them from speaking freely. The milk continued to arrive every morning and evening, accompanied now by adequate portions of bread, vegetables, and occasional meat. Their bodies were responding with visible changes, color returning to their cheeks, strength slowly rebuilding in muscles that had begun to waste from malnutrition. But the physical improvements brought emotional complications that Gisela found increasingly difficult to navigate. How could she accept this abundance, while knowing that her family in Munich likely survived on rations that grew smaller each week? Her sister Anna's last letter, which had reached her in France before her capture, had mentioned hunger in careful, understated terms that made the reality somehow worse. Her mother had stopped baking because there was no flour, no sugar, no butter. Her father had grown thin. And here Gisela sat in enemy captivity, drinking fresh milk twice daily, eating until her stomach felt satisfied rather than merely less empty. Katrin Richter held court at the opposite end of the barracks, surrounded by a shrinking group of women who still clung to the ideology they had been raised with. Katrin insisted that the American generosity was a manipulation tactic, designed to weaken their resolve and turn them against the fatherland. She argued that accepting the milk with gratitude was a betrayal of every German soldier still fighting, every citizen still suffering under Allied bombing campaigns. She spoke with the fervor of someone who needed her beliefs to remain intact because without them, she would have to confront what she had supported, what she had been part of, what crimes had been committed in the name of the Reich she served. Gisela listened to Katrin's speeches and felt something collapse inside her chest. She had seen the photographs that American officials had shown them, images from concentration camps that Allied forces had liberated. Mountains of skeletal bodies, living people who looked like animated corpses, children with numbers tattooed on their arms. The Americans had made them look at the photographs, had explained in careful detail what had been discovered at places called Dachau and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. Some women had refused to believe the images were real, insisting they were propaganda fabrications designed to justify Allied aggression. But Gisela had looked at those photographs and recognized the truth in them with a certainty that made her want to vomit. She had not known the specific details, but she had known something was wrong, had sensed it in the whispers that stopped when she entered rooms, in the trains that carried people east, who never returned, in the systematic erasure of neighbors whose only crime was their ancestry. She had known, and she had not asked questions, because asking questions was dangerous, and she had been more concerned with her own safety than with moral courage. May 14, 1945. Gisela entered the mess hall for breakfast and immediately noticed something different on the tables. Beside each milk pitcher sat smaller containers, cream pitchers made of the same metal, condensation already forming on their cold surfaces. The kitchen staff moved through the room, placing them with the same casual efficiency they brought to every meal, as if this addition was entirely ordinary, rather than extraordinary. Gisela sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the cream pitcher nearest to her, and felt something crack open in her chest that she had been carefully holding together since her capture. Cream. Not just milk, which was already more than she had dared to hope for, but cream, the thick, rich layer that rose to the top of fresh milk, the luxury her mother had once poured without thought into Sunday coffee, the substance that represented abundance rather than mere sustenance. Gisela reached out with a hand that trembled slightly, and lifted the small pitcher, tilting it to see the heavy liquid inside move slowly, coating the sides of the container in a way that watery substitutes never could. Beside her, Marlene made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, her usual stoic composure finally breaking. The cream was meant for their coffee, that bitter brown liquid made from real beans rather than roasted grain, another small luxury that had appeared in the mess hall the previous week. Gisela poured a generous amount into her cup and watched the white spiral down into the dark liquid, creating patterns that dissolved into a lighter brown. She stirred it slowly, lifted the cup to her lips, and tasted something that brought tears to her eyes, not because it was sad, but because it was kind. This was not necessary for survival. This was not required by any convention or regulation. This was simply kindness, pure and uncomplicated, offered to people who had every reason to expect the bare minimum instead. That evening, Gisela sat on her bunk and opened her diary to a fresh page, the pencil stub almost too small to hold comfortably now. She wrote carefully, each word chosen with the weight of someone trying to understand something that defied her entire understanding of how the world worked. They gave us cream today. For our coffee. I have been crying and I do not fully know why. How can our enemies treat us with more dignity than our own leaders did? We were told Americans were cruel, that they would starve us and abuse us and treat us as less than human. Instead, they give us cream for our coffee. Small luxury that says, you are worth more than survival, you are worth comfort, you are worth kindness, even though we have every reason to hate you. She paused, staring at the words on the page, then added one more line that felt like both confession and revelation. I think everything they told us was a lie. Not just some things. Everything. And if they lied about this, what else was false? What did I serve? What was I part of? Late May brought warmer weather to Montana, wildflowers blooming across the grasslands in waves of purple and gold. Sarah Miller drove the ranch truck through the camp gates on a Thursday morning, jars of strawberry preserves packed carefully in wooden crates beside her. Tom had suggested she make the delivery herself, partly because he had business in town and partly because he thought it might do her good to see the women who drank their milk each day. Sarah had resisted initially, then agreed with the same practical determination she brought to every difficult task in her life. Captain Richardson met her at the administrative building and helped carry the crates to the storage area near the kitchen. Sarah had expected to complete the delivery and leave quickly, but the captain asked if she would like to see the mess hall to understand how her products were being used. Something in the invitation felt like both courtesy and challenge, and Sarah Miller had never walked away from either. She followed Captain Richardson across the compound, aware of the German women watching from various work areas, their eyes curious and cautious in equal measure. The mess hall stood empty between meals, tables wiped clean, and waiting for the lunch service. Captain Richardson explained the routine, the portions carefully measured to meet Geneva Convention standards, and then some, the effort to provide variety and nutrition beyond bare minimums. Sarah listened and nodded and tried not to think about David, about whether he had received such care in the brief time between his landing on French soil and his death. She tried not to imagine him hungry or cold or afraid, but the thoughts came anyway, unwelcome and persistent as winter wind. The kitchen door opened and several German women entered, assigned to meal preparation duties. Among them was Gisela, who had proven herself reliable and was gradually being given more responsibilities. She stopped when she saw the two American women, her posture straightening automatically, years of military discipline showing in the gesture. Corporal Sanchez appeared to translate, and Captain Richardson made brief introductions. This is Mrs. Miller. Her ranch supplies your dairy products. Gisela looked at Sarah with an expression that moved through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, then something like gratitude, then a profound sadness that settled in her green eyes like fog in a valley. She spoke in careful English, words she had been practicing with Sergeant Hayes during his informal language lessons. Thank you. For the milk. For the cream. We had not tasted such things in very long time. Her accent was thick, her grammar imperfect, but her sincerity unmistakable. Sarah found herself looking into the face of a young woman, approximately the same age David would have been, and felt something complicated twist in her chest. This woman had worn a German uniform, had served the regime that sent soldiers to kill her son. But standing in this Montana mess hall, she looked like someone's daughter, someone's sister, a person rather than an abstraction of enemy. Sarah managed a stiff nod. You are welcome. Early June brought news that prisoners would be permitted to write letters home, subject to censorship, but allowed, nonetheless. Captain Richardson announced the policy during morning roll call and explained that mail service to Germany remained unreliable given the chaos of the defeated nation, but the Red Cross would attempt to deliver correspondence to families when possible. The women received paper and pencils, precious commodities they handled with care, and the barracks grew quiet that evening as 42 women attempted to explain their circumstances to people they had not seen in months or years. Gisela sat on her bunk with a blank sheet before her, the pencil poised above paper, while her mind struggled with what words to use. How could she tell Anna about the milk and cream without sounding like she was celebrating while her family starved? How could she describe the relative comfort of the camp without seeming to betray their shared suffering? She began several times, crossing out sentences that felt wrong, starting again with different approaches that satisfied her no more than the first attempts. "Dear Anna," she finally wrote, keeping her words simple and careful, "I am well and safe in an American prison camp in a place called Montana. The mountains here remind me a little of our trip to the Alps when we were children, though everything is bigger and emptier than anything in Germany. We are treated according to international law and receive adequate food and shelter. I hope this letter finds you and mother and father healthy and that circumstances have improved at home." She paused, staring at the inadequate words. How could she convey the strangeness of her situation, the way her understanding of the world had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt in the space of 6 weeks? She continued writing, choosing each word with the awareness that censors would read every line. "I think often of our last Sunday dinner together before I left for my posting. Do you remember Mother's butter cake and how we laughed when Father read that ridiculous story from the newspaper? I hold those memories carefully. They remind me of who I was before the war changed everything." Around her, other women wrote their own careful letters. Marlene composed a message to her parents on their Brandenburg farm, trying to explain American agriculture without admitting that enemy farmers seemed more prosperous than German ones had been, even before the war. Frida wrote to her sister in Hamburg, describing her medical work in the camp while avoiding any mention of how well supplied the American infirmary was compared to the German military hospitals she had worked in. Liesel, youngest of their group, wrote to her mother with simple longing that transcended politics, just wanting to be home regardless of what home had become. Gisela returned to her letter, adding a final paragraph that felt both honest and impossibly incomplete. "The Americans treat us with more dignity than I expected. I am learning English and trying to understand what comes next for all of us. Give mother and father my love. Tell them I am sorry for everything." She did not specify what she was sorry for, but the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. August arrived with heat that shimmered across the Montana grasslands, turning the compound's dirt paths to dust that rose in small clouds with every footstep. The war in the Pacific continued, but Germany's surrender in May had left the women in a strange limbo, no longer prisoners of an active conflict but not yet released or repatriated. They worked their assigned tasks, attended their English lessons with increasing fluency, and waited for decisions to be made by authorities in distant offices about what would become of them. Tom Miller appeared at the camp on the morning of August 9th with an unusual request for Captain Richardson. His ranch needed additional hands for the late summer harvest, and he wondered whether the camp might permit some prisoners to work outside the compound under supervision. The pay would be minimal but fair, and the women would return to the camp each evening. He needed 6 workers for approximately 3 weeks, people who were willing to do physical labor in exchange for wages they could save toward whatever future awaited them. Captain Richardson considered the request with careful deliberation. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoner work details under certain conditions, and the war's end made such arrangements more flexible than they would have been months earlier. She decided to present the opportunity to the prisoners themselves and let volunteers come forward rather than assigning anyone involuntarily. That evening at roll call, she explained the offer through Corporal Sanchez's translation, making clear that participation was optional and that no one would face consequences for declining. Gisela's hand rose almost immediately, followed quickly by Marlene, Frida, and Liesel. 2 other women, Helga Zimmerman and Anna Weber, also volunteered, creating exactly the number Tom had requested. They had different reasons for accepting. Gisela wanted to see something beyond the camp's wire fencing, to understand more about the country that had treated them so unexpectedly well. Marlene, raised on a farm, missed the physical labor that made her body tired in satisfying ways. Frida sought useful work beyond the limited medical duties available in camp. Liesel simply wanted to earn money, practical as always about securing resources for an uncertain future. The following Monday morning, Tom Miller arrived in his truck at 6 o'clock, and the 6 German women climbed into the bed with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was Gisela's first time outside the camp fence since her arrival 4 months earlier, and the sensation of movement through open landscape made her dizzy with something that felt almost like freedom, but was not quite. They drove through rolling grasslands where cattle grazed in scattered groups, past small farms with weathered barns and fields of wheat ready for harvest. Under a sky so vast and blue, it seemed impossible that war had ever touched the world. The Miller Ranch appeared in the distance, the main house white against the mountains, the barns and outbuildings arranged in practical order around it. Sarah stood on the porch watching their approach, and Gisela saw Tom speak briefly to his wife before helping the women down from the truck. The work was harder than Gisela had anticipated, her body unused to the sustained physical labor of harvest, despite months of improved nutrition. Tom set them to gathering vegetables from the extensive kitchen garden first, letting them build stamina before moving to heavier tasks. The August sun beat down on their backs as they moved through rows of tomatoes, beans, squash and carrots, filling wooden crates that Tom loaded onto the truck for transport to market. Sarah worked alongside them, demonstrating the proper way to check ripeness, to harvest without damaging the plants, to handle produce so it would last through transport and storage. Marlene took to the work with visible joy, her farm background evident in the efficient way she moved through the rows. She spoke to Sarah in broken English, supplemented with gestures, comparing Montana farming techniques to those she had known in Brandenburg. Sarah listened and responded, and gradually a conversation developed that transcended the language barrier through the universal understanding of people who knew the land and its rhythms. By the end of the first week, Marlene and Sarah worked side by side with an easy companionship that surprised them both. The second week brought wheat harvest, the kind of labor that required all hands working in coordinated effort. Tom operated the mechanical harvester while the women gathered and bundled sheaves, their arms aching and their skin burned dark by the relentless sun. Emma brought lunch to the fields each day, fried chicken and fresh bread and lemonade so cold and sweet that Gisela thought it might be the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The old woman sat with them during the meal break, asking questions about Germany with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, wanting to understand the country beyond what newspapers and propaganda had shown her. Evenings became the most remarkable part of the routine. Rather than returning to camp immediately after work ended, Tom invited the women to wash up and join the family for dinner. The first invitation had been tentative, offered almost apologetically, but it became standard practice as the days progressed. They ate at the long kitchen table, passing platters of food family style, and Gisela found herself sitting across from Sarah Miller, pouring milk from the same pitcher that had been delivered to the camp, tasting cream in her coffee while watching the sun set through windows that faced the mountains. The conversations at those dinners ranged widely. Tom spoke about ranching and the challenges of maintaining productivity with limited labor. Emma told stories about Montana's territorial days, when her own parents had homesteaded land that seemed impossibly wild and empty. Sarah asked careful questions about German agriculture, about what the women had known before the war, about their families and their hopes. Gisela found herself speaking more honestly than she had in years, the English words coming more easily each evening, describing her life as a teacher, her journey into military service, her growing understanding that everything she had believed was built on lies. September 3, 1945. Captain Richardson called an assembly in the mess hall, her expression serious as the women gathered in rows before her. Corporal Sanchez stood redmond and disapproval. Others offered brief farewells, quick hugs, promises to write if the chaos of occupied Germany allowed for mail service. Frida was among those leaving, her decision made after weeks of agonized consideration. Someone must help rebuild, she had explained to Gisela. Someone must go back and do the work of healing. I have medical skills Germany needs desperately. I cannot turn away from that duty no matter how appealing this American abundance might be. She climbed into the truck with her characteristic dignity, her nurse's training showing in the calm way she helped elderly women navigate the high step. The trucks pulled away slowly, raising dust that hung in the morning air like a curtain between past and future. Gisela stood watching until they disappeared from sight, aware that she was witnessing the final separation from the life she had known. The 14 remaining women returned to the barracks that now felt cavernously empty, their footsteps echoing in spaces that had been crowded only hours before. 2 days later, Sarah Miller arrived at the camp with an official letter for Captain Richardson and a simple question for Gisela. Would she be willing to work at the ranch permanently, managing the dairy production and helping with general farm operations? The position included housing in the small cottage near the barn, a modest salary, and the sponsorship necessary for Gisela's immigration application. Sarah presented the offer with straightforward practicality, making clear this was business arrangement rather than charity. Though both women understood it was also something more complicated, Gisela accepted with gratitude that made her voice shake, That evening she wrote a letter to Anna, knowing it would reach Germany months from now if it reached her sister at all. "I have made the hardest choice of my life," she wrote carefully. "I am staying in America. Not because I do not love you or mother or father, but because I cannot return to who I was, and Germany is the place where that person existed. I hope someday you will understand, and perhaps even forgive me." June 1950. 5 years after the end of the war in Europe, Gisela Schreiber stood in the Miller Ranch dairy barn, her hands moving through the familiar morning routine with the competence born of daily repetition. She had become Gisela Miller 2 years earlier when she married Tom and Sarah's nephew, a quiet man named Robert who had returned from the Pacific with his own share of war memories and an understanding that some journeys could not be explained to those who had not taken them. She kept her maiden name professionally, a small connection to who she had been, while building a new identity in this Montana landscape that no longer felt foreign. The cottage near the barn had become truly hers, filled with furniture she had chosen and books in both German and English that lined shelves Robert had, built with careful attention to her preferences. She had obtained American citizenship in 1948, taking the oath with a mixture of pride and persistent guilt that never quite disappeared. Letters from Anna arrived irregularly, describing life in occupied Germany with the careful optimism of someone determined to find hope in difficult circumstances. Their parents had survived the war, diminished but alive, and Anna had married a man who worked in reconstruction efforts in Berlin. This particular morning carried special significance. A group of 20 displaced persons from Eastern Europe were scheduled to arrive at a temporary processing center in town, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation with nothing but the clothes they wore and the trauma they carried. Gisela had volunteered to help with translation and orientation, her own experience making her valuable to organizations working with displaced populations. She had loaded the truck with supplies that morning, including several large containers of fresh milk and cream from the Miller dairy. As she worked, Sarah entered the barn and stood watching for a moment before speaking. "You have become quite good at this," she said simply. Gisela looked up and smiled, a genuine expression that came more easily now than it had in the early years. "You need to translate," though many prisoners now understood English well enough to follow without assistance. The captain held a telegram from the War Department, and the room fell silent as she began to read. Arrangements were being finalized for repatriation of German prisoners of war. Transport ships would depart from Boston beginning in October, carrying prisoners back to occupied Germany, where they would be processed and released to return to their homes, or what remained of them. Then came the second part of the announcement, the one that made Gisela's heart stutter in her chest. In light of exceptional circumstances and the end of hostilities, any prisoner who wished to apply for permission to remain in the United States could submit a formal request. Applications would be reviewed individually, no guarantees could be made, but provisions existed under SENT. Immigration law for special cases involving displaced persons who had demonstrated good conduct and could secure employment and housing. The captain paused, letting Corporal Sanchez translate, watching the women's faces as understanding settled over them. Gisela sat frozen on the bench, her mind racing through implications and possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider until this moment. Return to Germany meant trying to find her family in a destroyed country, facing the collective guilt and judgment of a defeated nation, rebuilding a life from ashes and shame. Staying in America meant abandoning her family, choosing a new country over blood ties, becoming something she could not quite define, but that felt both terrifying and necessary. That night the barracks erupted in urgent whispered conversations. Katrin Richter declared loudly that any woman who chose to stay was a traitor to the fatherland, turning her back on her duty to help rebuild Germany. Several women agreed with her immediately, their decisions already clear. Helga Zimmermann spoke tearfully about her parents who were elderly and would need her help. Others worried about siblings, about grandparents, about the moral weight of staying comfortable in America while their families suffered in occupied Germany. Marlene lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling and spoke quietly to Gisela in the darkness. "My family's farm is in the Soviet zone. I do not know if they are even alive. If they are alive, I do not know what the Russians have done to them or to our land. What do I go back to?" Frida, practical as always, pointed out that Germany would need nurses desperately, that her skills could save lives in the chaos of occupation and reconstruction. But her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Gisela pulled out her diary and tried to write, but words failed her. She could not explain even to herself what the right choice was, what moral calculation could balance family duty against self-preservation, what she owed to the past versus what she owed to her own future. October 9th, 1945. The transport trucks arrived at dawn to collect the women who had chosen repatriation. 28 prisoners had decided to return to Germany, their belongings packed in small bags that represented the sum total of what they owned in the world. 14 women, including Gisela, had submitted applications to remain in the United States, their paperwork pending approval through channels that moved with bureaucratic slowness. They stood together near the camp gate, those leaving and those staying, trying to find words adequate to the moment. Helga embraced Gisela with tears streaming down both their faces. "Tell my story," Helga whispered in German. "Tell them we were not all monsters. Tell them some of us tried to be decent even when decency became difficult." Gisela nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Katrin Richter walked past without acknowledging the women who were staying, her back rigid with judgment. "Taught me well," she replied, her English now fluent with only the slightest accent remaining. The two women worked side by side for a while in comfortable silence, the kind that develops between people who have moved beyond politeness into authentic connection. Later that afternoon, Gisela stood in the processing center and watched frightened families accept cups of milk with the same disbelief she had felt 5 years earlier. A young Polish woman looked at her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," in halting English. Gisela took her hand gently and responded in Polish she had learned specifically for this work, telling her that abundance was possible, that kindness existed, that the worst moment was not the final moment. She thought about that morning in April 1945, when she had first tasted fresh milk in American captivity, how impossible it had seemed that enemies could treat her with such dignity. She understood now that the milk had never been just about nutrition. It had been about recognizing humanity in people who had been taught to deny it in themselves and others. It had been about offering second chances to those willing to become different than they had been. And it had been about discovering that home was not a place you came from, but rather a place you built with people who chose to see your potential rather than only your past.